Hi, I'm Irene Greif. I will introduce myself in a moment, but first I wanted to say for people who can count that, yes, we are short one panelist. Logan Smalley came to the meeting but is sick and can't make it to this panel, so he really tried. How many people have looked at TED Ed? How many people have used TED Ed in teaching? Not a lot. So, okay. I was trying to, if time allows, maybe we'll try to find a way to weave in from what you've seen, some reactions to TED Ed. But I think from our discussions over lunch, we have more than enough to discuss among the three of us who are here. So we think we have a lively and interesting panel for you. By way of introducing myself, because I'm a bit of a newcomer to the learning space, I'm at IBM Research down the street, actually. We were part of Lotus Research, so that's my connection to Eileen Rudden, and we were acquired by IBM. I have done research over the years in collaboration and social software, and actually see a lot of connections to what's happening in this field. I'm personally interested in moving in this area, as is IBM. We've done a lot of work in my group over the years on looking at phenomena in the consumer space, in social space, and seeing what impact and what value they could have in a business setting, what it will mean to do things that were done anonymously on the web in an authenticated way in front of your manager at work, what the values are. We're looking at how to help employees be more engaged, just as people here are looking at trying to get students engaged, and we have research on games and gamification. And more we're noticing that with social software, a lot of the corporate value is in the data left behind, the data exhaust, and the things we could do when we analyze that data, personalizing employee systems, personalizing marketing campaigns based on external social data, and so on. And I think that's very much aligned with some of the things we'll hear about here on data analytics. So I was helping organize this conference and volunteered to moderate this panel because of the connections I see and the questions I'm looking forward to asking here. What we'd like to do is have everybody kind of briefly introduce themselves, and then we're going to talk a bit about problems as seen by a high school student with the current educational system, and ways that people in two different kinds of educational technology companies are trying to address some of those problems. We'll discuss among ourselves for a while, and then we'll open it for conversation with you. So would you like to start? Introduce yourself.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for staying late on a Saturday. We've got the anchor's position here for the panels and the presentations. It's been a great weekend. My name is Gerard LaFond. I'm the VP of Marketing at Alleyoop. We are an incubated startup within Pearson. And Alleyoop's mission is to help teens and their parents better prepare for college. College readiness is something you've probably heard a lot about. It's a pretty acute problem. 1 in 3 college freshmen don't make it to their second year. Did any of you guys know that? I'm sure some of you guys knew that. And you know, there's problems all along the education sector. We think by making learning a little bit more fun, a little bit more adaptive, a little more personalized, and bringing a vast network of learning services direct to students, direct to parents, we can make a difference. By way of my background, I came to Alleyoop as a traditionally trained marketer. I ran an advertising agency for a number of years, but I also co-founded a video game company called Persuasive Games in Atlanta in 2003. And we did some pretty crazy games. Some of them were education related. Some were about public policy. Some were about healthcare issues. And really found that the power of games can contribute to increased learning for young people who've grown up in a digital video game world. So that's a little bit of my background.
Great. I'm Brian Fitzgerald. I'm the Vice President of Product Development for Knewton. And Knewton is developing kind of an enterprise-grade, web-scale adaptive learning platform. And I think this panel is about adaptive learning, so I think we'll get into the nuance of what adaptive learning is and the way that we're approaching it. But in general, what Knewton's trying to do is actually empower people who have educational products, whether you're a content provider or a learning product, anything that's digital, give you the ability to make it adaptive, so that every student can get their own experience, to be able to move through a learning experience at their own pace, and focus on the bits of it that they need the most help with. And the way that we approach that, I think, is in a fairly sophisticated way. We don't kind of take it lightly. But I think the evidence so far, we've been at this for about 5 years or so, is starting to bear out that this approach is working. So kind of excited to talk about that. It's an open platform, so we we are again helping to enable people to make their products adaptive. So right now we may work with larger education companies and universities, but we're starting to work with smaller and smaller entities. We're really into the startup community and like the notion of working with startups to try to make their products adaptive so that you can focus on the problem that you're trying to solve. And so have been talking to people over the last couple of days and very interested to talk to more people about what we're up to. And then briefly, as far as my background, I've been doing kind of internet product development. My first internet company was here in Cambridge in 1995. I've worked in Silicon Valley for a bunch of years at startups. Spent a lot of time at Yahoo early on, building lots of kind of scalable products in Silicon Valley and Europe. And then in the last about 8 or 9 years, I've focused on education in New York. And that's really my passion. So that's why I'm excited to be here.
Good. And we were having a little competition over lunch of who was the least from this field, because I thought I had to be apologizing, but I see we have very varied backgrounds anyway. Right. And now we're about to get, a new high school graduate. I thought he was going to be our only high school student. Do we have any other high school students here? So you might still win the prize for youngest attendee.
Usually
so,
I do, but yeah.
Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so about 2 years ago, I became really frustrated with my school experience. I found that what I was learning outside of school was much more valuable than what was going on in the classroom. I moved from a district in Long Island, from Bethpage, New York, to Syosset, New York, which is a much more high-ranking, competitive district. And I became really disenfranchised with the entire system. I felt my voice wasn't being heard. That my output and my input in terms of how education should be structured and how it should be led wasn't being valued at all. And I just decided to speak with a lot of students, parents, and educators. And I realized that a student perspective and a student voice wasn't there on the policy decision-making process. I decided to write a book, and I'll be launching a movement in a few months called Learning Revolution, where I feel that right now education really needs to be transformed from the bottom up. So the people who are in the classroom every single day. And I think politics, unfortunately, has become very polarized. It's become really a tit-for-tat kind of battle between different types of fields. And I think what really needs to happen is for students to get ownership of their school experiences, for teachers and students to become collaborators, for classrooms to become really hardwired with technology, where startups are focusing on all these different types of industries that are currently blossoming, and for what I call a city as a school model, where we treat communities and cities as classrooms and incubators, where children are engaging in mentorships and apprenticeships and internships to create that kind of real-world experience rather than be stuck in the walls of a classroom every single day.
Great, thank you. What I'd like to explore a little bit is how the approaches that these two are taking will fit with that grander vision, and then we could discuss what else might be needed. So, Gerard, I know that you're taking a kind of gamification approach. How do you think that will help with engage the disenfranchised student and start this movement?
It sounds like what's happened to our high school student here is that we have a poorly designed game. So when I design games, I need to make sure that they're easy to play and hard to master. And there's this whole scientific approach to a term that we use a lot at Alleyoop called flow, where you have to keep somebody, rightfully challenged, but not bored. And you need to adapt to that individual learner so that you're putting in front of that person just the right challenge, just the right motivation, just the right reward at the right time. So, what we're trying to do over at Alleyoop is we're trying to borrow what works in game design. The previous discussion about badges, I would argue that probably everybody in this room has a badge that they're very proud of. My first job, I hanged it on the wall. You guys all know what I'm talking about? A degree, right? That's a badge. It's not about badges. It's about the education behind it. It's about the motivation towards that badge. My parents told me at an early age, I'm going to college. You're going to college. It was not even an option. I'm thankful for it, I guess. But I ended up with a degree because that was the badge I had to have, I thought, to be successful in today's career marketplace. I think the kinds of skills that we need our future young people, and obviously really smart and articulate young people, is we have to motivate them properly. We have to make sure that we're adapting to their needs, that we're adapting our curriculums to external needs. What are the careers of the future going to look like? And this isn't my term, but somebody said, when you work with others in the workplace, that's called teamwork. When you work with others in high school, it's called cheating. It's just incompatible with what they're going to be facing in college and then ultimately career. So I think the message that I get from your book and your experience is that school is a poorly designed game, and we can do better.
So as you design games better and taking into account what you just said about teams, are your games team games so that people learn collaboration?
Yeah, so, I hate to use the example of Farmville, but, social gaming is quite successful and popular. Maybe Zynga's not making as much as we all thought they would. But they make a lot of money, and there's a lot of people playing those games. Games are more fun with others. I think learning is more fun with other people as well. You look at where a lot of the blended learning and some of the other things we've heard about earlier in this conference are going. It's project-based, it's team-based. Games have been doing that for a long time, and I think we can learn a lot from that.
What would you say about how big data and analytics are going to help us build adaptive systems and support the teachers in the classrooms?
Yep. Well, one of the things I was going to say, just as you were talking about some of your frustration and sort of what led you to write the book, is a lot of the reason why I actually got into education and technology in the first place. I was doing consumer products, for a bunch of years, and it was just confounding to me that a lot of the problems that were being solved in these other vertical markets were never being applied to education. Simple as recommendations and personalized experiences that exist for products and movies and music, but never for people's education experience. And the sort of juxtaposition for me was the dinner time conversations I would have with my wife, who's an educator. She was a teacher for a lot of years, and then she was a principal. And we used to constantly talk about her challenges, which were trying to figure out how to do differentiated learning, right? And so I know that great teachers can do this really well at a certain amount of students, whether that's 6 students or 10 students. But at some point, it becomes very unscalable and it breaks. So I had this dissonance of all of these other consumer products that were giving highly personalized experiences, but then this problem, which is the same problem that I feel like talking about our kind of school experiences, even held me back when I was in school. And it just made no sense to me that some of these solutions couldn't be applied. So when I got to talking to Jose about the notion of Knewton and what he was thinking, it really resonated with me. So to your question about what can big data do and analytics to try to help, I think that we're in a much different place than we were even 10 years ago, where a lot of the products right now that we're able to create can actually leverage this massive amount of information. So education produces more data really than any other industry in the world. And every day, all the time, all that information just goes into the ether and it disappears and we never are able to capture it. So what we're up to is really just trying to capture all of that information and connect it. So that's not just what a student is answering right or wrong on a multiple choice question, which yes is an important input, but not the only input. It's the activity that happens on the system. It's understanding the content at a really, really granular level. We call it an atomic concept level. But maniacally focused on tagging that content in a really, really granular way. These are all the mechanisms that we use to then kind of combine data science and psychometrics, which is kind of statistics around education. So we leverage all that to be able to, in any given moment, if an individual student wants to learn something, kind of query that database and say, is there anybody, are there any patterns that ever existed to trying to, help a student like this in any given moment? And we look for, patterns in users who have ever been on the system, strategies that they've used that have helped, and even pairing people up with those who have recently mastered something, because we talk about kind of peer-based learning. That may be a great way for them to be able to learn. But in the end, I think that the data, if we're able to leverage it in an appropriate way, can actually lead to a much different experience than you had when you were going through high school.
So would you be looking at social data as well? And if the kids are just plain unhappy and complaining, will you deliver that to the teacher?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, assessment data is part of it, but there are so many different personality traits. I mean, we have hundreds of these different traits, not just your activity, but your perceptions of the world, your experiences, et cetera. These are all being filtered into kind of, what we call kind of a learning profile, which helps to understand an individual student at any time. And so, Knewton kind of works out of the box. It can start to adapt to you within a few minutes. But when you're taking 2 and 3 courses, we're starting to build, kind of a really interesting idea about what works for you and what doesn't, and in really different contexts. Somebody was talking yesterday about the notion that, I think it was Dr. Sonwalker was talking about how people can learn in certain ways certain concepts, but when you're learning different concepts, you have a whole different construct for the way that you learn, right? Well, it's really hard for a teacher to be able to discern that, especially if they're teaching, kind of multiple ideas. But if we can, simply have that at a data level, and then in any given moment, you give somebody a recommendation that helps them break through, I mean, that can be the reason why, somebody doesn't move on to the next class, right? Or get into a field that they find really interesting, but they never thought they'd be good at.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so do either of these, schools a poorly designed game or let's look for patterns?
I really think that's when I've looked at different schools, and especially to your point about games, I think there's a school called Quest to Learn in New York City, and it's just, I was just reading that there was a big New York Times Magazine story on it, and it's just extraordinary to the way these kids are learning. They love going to school every day. I think that's the question I usually ask the students whenever I visit a school is, do you love going to school every day? And if the answer on most of the times is yes, usually that's a pretty good school, because the kids are engaged, they like going there, they feel safe, it's a protective environment, they're really using all these different types of abilities that they have. Because right now, we have such a high dropout rate in American schools. It's about every 9 seconds a kid drops out of school. And what they've found is that these kids, a number of them, yes, they need to have more money for their families, but a good majority of them have said that the reason they dropped out was that because they found their classes to be really uninteresting to them. They could have finished high school, but they just decided not to go. And I think really engaging students, finding ways for them to take that ownership, and I think there's a lot of research that's coming out of the Mozilla Foundation as well as the MacArthur Foundation about badges and intrinsic motivation and letting kids take that control. Because what I've found is that in the best schools, the teachers and the students are co-collaborators, and they have that kind of rich partnership that's going on. They understand how children are learning. There's kind of a personalization aspect to it. And then there's that intrinsic motivation, most importantly, where they take that kind of agency and moving from something called, from pedagogy to andragogy, where children are taking that ownership. It's something called adult leading learning based on problems rather than content.
So are badges, the opposite of intrinsic motivation, and are they a danger or a risk right now? Or
I think they're, in many ways, people like to associate badges as like rewards, but I think there's some advantage to it, and there's kind of the credentialization of this kind of system where you have edX, you have all these different, you have MOOCs where people can basically get a certificate if they complete this course, and this kind of informal accreditation. Badges can certainly help, I think. And I think in the jobs market, I would say in the next few years, people are going to start hiring. First of all, they already are based on your portfolio, but based on also the kind of professional development that you're doing. If you're taking more courses online, if you're working on a certain problem, if you're getting these kind of badges for these different types of skills, that's going to really make, I think, a much bigger impact rather than just the 4-year diploma, which has some value today, but I think is declining as we speak.
Do you have any questions for each other?
Actually, just one point to build on this notion of engagement. Like, I do think that one of the things that we're studying, right, is this notion of in what context badges can work versus other contexts. And we've got some experience in a not too dissimilar space to Alleyoop in developmental math, where we've been kind of deploying courses at places like ASU and Washington State and UNLV. Turns out the way that folks who are in those classes learn and the kind of engagement mechanisms and dynamics are very different than what we see when early on in our company we were doing test prep products, right, for highly motivated GMAT students, for example. And so again, kind of another one of our theses are, your ability to kind of collect data and see in what context, certain mechanisms are going to work will allow us to effectively be able to pivot off of that and create different experiences, maybe for different individuals in any given time. We were talking at lunch a little bit about, kind of user experience and whether or not it starts to cross lines when you actually change the UX, in the middle of somebody's experience. Of course, you probably need to have, considerations around that. However, if we do know what kind of systems like badges, work for a certain subset of the population, why not give them, kind of a different experience, not just content related, but full experience related.
Go ahead.
I was just going to comment on the school that you referenced in New York. One of the things that's really powerful when you make a game is you learn everything about the subject the game is made about, and that's something that can be extremely powerful in a learning environment. And you can get a lot of young people very excited about a very complex issue if you tell them they're going to make a game about it. So I think that's a really good example. That's not just badges. So there's game mechanics, and we've talked about badges probably too much, but there's a lot of things about games that I like to borrow. Online learning in general actually takes advantage of this all the time. It's safe to fail in an online environment. If you get the question wrong, the only person that sees it, probably, unless your data is tracking every single thing, is me, right? And I think the original keynote from yesterday, they talked about that young learner who dreamt about those green check marks. If you play, how many of you guys play games? We got some gamers. Okay. Even the guys and girls who have their hands down, you probably have a game on your phone. But games actually give you feedback that's much more relevant, much more graphical, often much more exciting and surprising and delightful than that green check mark. If the green check mark is making kids dream about learning, you can imagine what we could do if we borrowed some of the feedback loops from games like Call of Duty or World of Warcraft.
Actually, you reminded me of a statistic I heard this week from a talk by Jane McGonigal, saying that
right.
80% of the time in games you're failing.
Yeah.
And pointing out how powerful that is because people learn from failure and how you're just not allowed to do that in the real world at school, or she was saying in business. You can't risk failing that much.
And there's a social stigma,
Yeah.
right? If I raise my hand in a class, my friends might think I'm dumb, right? So there's all kinds of aspects to this where failure is a really great way to learn, and yet our school is not designed well for failure. The stakes are too high. The social context is problematic. And if we can create opportunities where it's safe for these kids to fail, we're going to create great learning opportunities, I think, as well.
I mean, just drawing from that, I think there's always this. I usually see this sign whenever I visit really bad schools. Failure is not an option. And I think failure is really the only option in this case, because that's really where once you're taking risks, once you're accepting failure, continuously recovering from the process, that's really how you learn. And I think when I've noticed about young gamers and people, just young scientists and young innovators, what they're really focusing on is DIY learning. So really creating and becoming kind of this maker and tinkering centers around the country that are really coming about. And I think that's where the future of education is going to come and is arriving as we speak, because what's happening is that we have all these maker fairs, we have maker spaces, hacker spaces. I think that's where the true innovation is occurring for young innovators, and I think that's where we need to put a lot of resources and money into.
Would you like to start telling people to go to the mics? Are you ready for other
Sure, let's take
questions?
some questions.
People, go to mics. Oh, we have one right away. I don't even have to do a filler question.
Brian,
Okay.
Brian, you mentioned Dr. Sodwalker, and one thing that I was really struck with during his comments, and I've talked a lot, but he made the distinction between adaptive learning and pseudo-adaptive learning. He pointed out that a lot of things like tutoring or simply just keep trying and you fail could be considered adaptive learning. So I was wondering if you see that same distinction, and if so, how, as an adaptive learning company, you distinguish yourself from those pseudo-adaptive.
Yeah, it's a great question. So Knewton started in 2008. I think of commercial companies, we were one of the first to start to talk about adaptive learning, at least kind of in this wave. Although the concept is a lot older than that. At this point, adaptive learning is something that is very pervasive, and we talk about it all the time. I think there are easy ways to do adaptive learning, and there are hard ways to do adaptive learning. Our lot in life and our choice has definitely been to take the hard approach, and I think that when I say easy, I'm talking about more kind of deterministic approaches. Ask somebody a few questions, based on the responses to those questions, send them in a path, one direction or the other. What we're up to is a lot more like what he was talking about yesterday, which is instrumenting the whole experience, right? And constantly and consistently updating our hypotheses about what you know and don't know at a very, very finite level. So your activity, other people's activity on the system, and not within a closed system. So we see a lot of these technologies and apps really that have been doing this kind of thing for a limited set of content, which can be really cool and in a limited way. I think where we start to get into kind of measurable improvements is when you start to look at the patterns of content that exist across many different sources, many different education products, you really start to see interesting patterns, right? So we, just in the past year have started to work with folks like Pearson, Wiley, HMH, kind of at large publisher level, also across universities, people like ASU and so forth. In some cases, some of those subject areas are similar, right? And so in aggregate, we've now, I was looking at the numbers this morning, we're up to about 600,000 users who are using the product, and we'll probably this week surpass our 100 millionth recommendation. The kinds of insights that you start to see when you get to that scale is sort of, even beyond what I thought we would be able to see a year ago.
But with this kind of sophisticated analytics that must be underlying this, are you challenged in how you present this to a teacher in an actionable form? I mean,
Yes.
It's hard, okay.
No, absolutely. I mean, so, when I walk over to the kind of data science part of our office, and that group has grown, it's larger. That group is larger than when I started the company at this point. The models that they're looking at and the way that they represent, in the data visualizations will make your head spin the way that they're interpreting the data. But part of the product challenge for what we're trying to do is I need to try to figure out how to make this consumable and actionable for instructors and students, right? So we pay an awful lot of attention to, kind of keeping just the salient bits available and presenting the data in a way that allows a teacher, who's walking into the classroom in 10 minutes to to get some actionable information so that he or she can actually change the way that they teach, right? So
So it's a kind of just-in-time teaching is also a part of your philosophy.
It
I
is.
think,
It's all based on kind of real time. And an example of one of these features, talking about the models that you're describing, what we're doing is in real time generating study groups so that when a teacher walks into a classroom, they can parse the group in terms of students who have either recently mastered something or are soon to recently master something with people who learn the way that you do, right? So those groups can start to collaborate in a physical environment together. And a few years ago, a good teacher might try to do that kind of a technique, right? But they're constantly trying to calibrate on who should be with whom and how do I move them from place to place. And with the data now, you can actually do it pretty easily.
So one last question before I go over there. How does it sound to you if you think the student should be taking more control, do you want access to that data too? Do you have a different notion of how a student would control?
Yeah, I mean, I think students definitely want to see progress. They want to see how they've been advancing in a certain area. I think I don't know as much about data as you, of course, but I mean, I think that what children want to really understand is how they're progressing. Are they mastering a certain subject? What are their flaws? Where do they need help? And I think a teacher oftentimes doesn't have access to that information because it's just, like you said, it just goes into the mist. You don't really know where it goes. And I think these different types of technologies and startups are looking at how we can give them the ownership as well as how we can track their data and how they're looking at certain types of learning outcomes. And outcomes is really the most important part to look at.
We'll come back to that. Let's see what the question is over there.
So the question is, we're still structured around this 1 year common learning experience. And as we get more into adaptive learning and the learning gaps between individuals will kind of increase. So I was interested in reading about ASU and what Knewton was doing with them and how kids, some are struggling with it, some are done in half the time, and then they have nothing else challenging to do at the end of the course. So how do we tackle that gap that will develop as we go more into adaptive learning?
Yeah, I mean, ASU is a place that is really progressive in their thinking about that, and you can argue about whether or not other folks will follow. I'm sure many of them will, but so some of the experience that we had at ASU were putting people through these developmental courses, and just kind of top line experience over the past year. We sent, I think it's over 10,000 or so students through that program. The pass rates for the course were around 66%. We were able to raise it within the first year up to 75% on average. If you subtract out one or two of the different sections, it was actually more like in the low 90s. But one of the interesting statistics that came out of that was that 45% of the students who ran through that course finished early, right? Which is a notion that has never existed before, right? So to your question, what happens when somebody finishes early, right? I mean, they happen to pace because they're only working on the things that they're having difficulty with. Well, the way ASU is thinking about it is, great, let's just track them into their first year math course, or let's track them into a second tier course. Or let's let them get that math requirement out of the way and go on to their own major. So I think you're going to see things really start to change once people begin to adopt this more competency-based kind of learning model.
Okay.
Brian, I was reading that same article about your experience at ASU, and I'm kind of curious to just hear, as you guys look ahead to the next 3 or 4 years, it makes a lot of sense why you started with math and why you started at the remedial level. How do you guys think about how easy it's going to be to extend, beyond remediation into not just introductory, but sort of higher level stuff in higher ed, and then subject-wise going outside math, which seems like a really natural application into other subject areas?
Yeah, so we're kind of content and domain agnostic. So we do talk about some of these math examples, but at this point, Knewton is being used for math, for reading, writing, economics. We're in a lot of sciences, and we're starting to do some business books as well. So we're starting to branch out into other areas. I think there are certain subjects that you start to get a little bit more challenged in terms of the way the assessments are actually done. But the kind of rule of thumb for us is that if somebody can assess whether or not you got it, and there's a rubric for measuring, right, whether or not they understood the material, we're probably able to instrument it so that we can drive adaptive learning off of it. There are some things like philosophy, right, that it's kind of impossible to do. And Knewton will never be able to power those things, or at least maybe in my lifetime.
So a little bit related to what you just talked about is how do you measure the things that aren't, I mean, for gamification or for any sort of data science being applied to learning, how do you quantify things that, we might not even know we are losing out on, by having a human expert who, has applied the knowledge in multiple areas? I just wonder if, how complex are we really getting? Are we missing something in the one-on-one assessment that used to exist?
Absolutely, and I think the one thing that I want to make sure everybody here understands is that we're not at all trying to replace that one-on-one kind of experience. In fact, we would like to see that happen even more, right? We think that teachers oftentimes are spending time trying to figure out where each student is in class, and they don't have as much time to spend on kind of the real connection and the higher level type of teaching. And so the analytics are really there in order to try to facilitate that. But going back to the original part of your question, I think that we have certain hypotheses about what we think will work and help people to get through material in a more efficient and effective way. And then we've got lots of models which are just kind of looking at what patterns are existing, right? And what can we discern from these patterns? And I mean, we're constantly learning about things that we didn't necessarily sit in a room and hypothesize about that happen to start to get teased out of the data now. And I think more and more, in the future, we're going to start to, really be able to pivot off of those things. I mean, the whole system we've built is kind of a machine-learned system, so the algorithms themselves are not hard-coded, right? They're actually changing as a result of what data is being generated.
I just add to that, none of this technology is going to replace great teachers. It's just going to make them better. And even in games, if you play a game like World of Warcraft or another massively multiplayer online game, you get a ton of feedback, not just from the game, but from the people you play the game with. I would encourage you guys, if you are not familiar with World of Warcraft, go to YouTube and type in the search query, Leroy Jenkins and World of Warcraft. Some of you may know what I'm talking about. You'll get a good laugh about it after this conference. There's a ton of team-based learning happening in a game like that, and a ton of feedback. And I think what we're talking about is something in games that we call like the map mechanic, which is I always want to know where I'm at, where I've been, and where I need to go. And teachers are really good at doing that. Technology can help amplify and scale that. And I think that's what we're talking about here.
Okay. Another question there.
Hello. I have a question targeted toward, comment toward Nikhil. You mentioned learning outcomes, and going back to how you opened talking about the job process and people looking at portfolios and experiences rather than grades, right? And we talked about mastery. Like, what do you envision some of these learning outcomes to be? And then is there a universal set of learning outcomes that we're driving towards?
Yeah, so there are a lot of great companies that I think are working on this right now. There's a company called RadMatter, based in New York. There's a company called Degreed. And what they're trying to do, founded by David Blake in San Francisco, and what they're trying to do is put together kind of your different skill set. And maybe for Degreed, for example, say you took like linear algebra at MIT, or you took philosophy at Stanford, like online. They're trying to put all these different skill sets together. So then eventually when you show that to employers, here's my portfolio, here are the things that I've done. And I forgot the company, the name, Knewton, by there's two entrepreneurs. And what they're also trying to do is, say you're reading an article like on the New York Times, or you just read a book. How can you really show somebody that you understand this information? How can you demonstrate to an employer that you have this kind of knowledge at your fingertips? So they're trying to find a way to put that in a system where people can easily access it and realize that he has this knowledge, he understands this kind of mastery, and he knows these types of problems. So I think there are a lot of companies in ed tech right now that are slowly slowly kind of understanding how this kind of portfolio system is going to be changing credentialization, but there hasn't been really a unanimous kind of process where somebody can go yet. But I think in the next few years it'll be much more successful.
And thank you for bringing that up, because I was going to come back. I had also made a note in my little scribbles here of outcome when you said it, and well, now we have another questioner, but I was going to use this as my final round of questions that I think we've been talking about adaptive learning mostly in terms of learning styles as opposed to goals or outcomes. And how do we do adaptive teaching, adaptive curriculum, whatever, based on people having different goals and different desirable outcomes?
Yeah.
And if any of you want to comment on that.
No, it is all we think about
Okay.
when we think about whether or not we're doing our job or not. So in the end, somebody is providing us some context typically when they use Knewton. So this is the goal of this course. It's to finish by X date. It's to master X amount of concepts. It's to reach these learning objectives. That provides the context in which the system kind of operates. So
that's where you said you were agnostic. Somebody else has to tell you outcomes, and then you help people move
Yep.
towards that.
Exactly. And the system is flexible enough to know based on those goals what to do. But absolutely, all we do is think about whether or not, is this actually driving at student outcomes? Is this making the situation better for a student? And if it's not, we go back and sharpen our pencils and say, okay, how do we need to tweak the system in order to make sure that it does?
How do you think about desirable outcomes?
Yeah, so it's defining how you win the game.
Okay.
But it's more than that, truly. Yeah, I'll use an example. Again, back to World of Warcraft. It takes about 600 hours to get to the good stuff in World of Warcraft. And what that means is you do a lot of grunt work before you get there. 600 hours. If I could get 10% of that timeshare from kids working on something like algebra, above and beyond the classroom, at home, instead of Facebook, instead of YouTube, instead of their Xbox, I've got to think that's a win. And so our company in particular is spending a lot of our time actually over the last 6 months starting to focus on efficacy, whether this is really making a difference. But you need a lot of numbers. We're at about 100,000 users right now. We're really proud of that. But once you get 1 million recommendations and all those data points, then you can start really saying this thing's working. But right now what I'm trying to do is just get more time with these kids, motivated to achieve in school.
Okay, so we'll take a last question and then last comments from the panel.
All right, good. Hopefully this can serve as some semi wrap up. It's for all three of you, and there's an A and a B part. For Gerard and Brian, I'm curious about the balance between data-driven and maybe observation, hands-on feedback that's driving your constant innovation. I mean, there's some companies that basically eschew, touching customers because it's a distraction, it's an illusion, maybe. And I'm just curious what your take is on that. And Nikhil, my comment to you is, or question to you is, as a student, what do you hope companies like Knewton and Alleyoop are learning in terms of being able to generate the kind of experiences that you think will really be effective?
So you could each answer and/or just say what you'd like for wrapping up.
Yeah, so data for us, we look at every interaction on our platform. We track everything, probably too many things. But those make a lot of our decisions around the product and whether we think it's working or not. But one of the things that I'm really proud of is we bring a lot of young people into our offices. We go out to the communities, around the country. We visit with young people. We visit with teachers. We visit with parents. But we've really focused on the teenager. We built our product for the teenager first, and that has sometimes been in conflict with teachers and parents. And I think you said it best. You want this bottom-up approach to education. You want to take control of your future, and we're trying to build a platform that does that.
Yeah, I mean, we have talked a lot about data, and I think that data absolutely is at the core of what Knewton is trying to do. At the same time, we are all about that end student experience, right, and the end user experience, and trying to make whatever the permutation is that gets spat out of the recommendation engine, have that make sense within an educational context. And so we spend, I would say, equally, if not more time thinking about, making sure that it's just not a black box, right? That just is constantly based on a certain proficiency score, sending something out. So we spent a lot of time with partners like Pearson and others thinking about what is the experience for an instructor, what is the experience for a student, and in the context of us serving, a recommendation of content or providing an analytic, how do we do that in a way that's really consumable and usable and is actually going to move the needle when it comes to outcomes? So we think long and hard about that. I honestly think that that's as an important ingredient as the data that we're providing.
Yeah, I would say that what's really important is, like you were saying, to talk to young people, constantly bring them into the discussion. What I always say is that it's young people not necessarily have all the answers, but what they offer is really the fresh perspective and the fresh angle to something. And especially in a space like gaming, that's your target audience. Those are the people you're working with. Those are their parents are going to be helping them buy the products, or themselves later on are going to buy the products. And I think once you take into account their voices, as well as teachers, and I think that's something that's very rarely talked about, because oftentimes many teachers have never experienced these kind of technologies before. They've never actually been working with ed tech companies or startups. And I think bringing them into the conversation is absolutely important because many teachers, many of them are veteran teachers. They were educating in an age where there really was no internet or much technology or computers in the classroom. And once you kind of rope them into the process, and once you show them that these technologies, not only the kids love to do, and will help you and make your classroom more efficient, but it will just make the learning process much more worthwhile. And that's when you really change the equation, if you could say.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you, panel.